So good afternoon to everybody. And the topic that I have chosen for the next couple of weeks, I'm not sure this will carry through the 4 weeks of this series, but I will see how it goes. But the topic that I've chosen is politics and religion, good or bad for the Jews. And I'm basically going to begin today with an assessment of two things. First of all, the very recent rapprochement between the Emirates, between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, which is, of course, very significant, and the US election. So I want to, first I'll talk about the Emirates. And I'm going to, by the way, I hope you don't mind, and if you don't mind, I don't really care, because I'm going to do it anyhow, but I'm going to be very personal in a lot of this, because I've had, in my rabbinical assembly life, which now is my past life, I had a lot of involvement in some of these issues, and in one way or another, that I'm going to share as part of, and including the UAE, the Emirates, and what happened, what was announced last week, which again was quite exciting and leading to a point which was expected for quite a while, that that there would be recognition coming from the Gulf states, coming from the Emirates, and other countries in that area who really do not harbor strong negativity toward Israel. On the contrary, who admire Israel and who really were waiting for the opportunity for their benefit to establish relations with Israel. So the personal experience I have, and I've shared this in some contexts in the past, was when I was the president of the Rabbinical Assembly in 2016 to 2018. I was, by virtue of that position, I was a member of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. I believe one of the only Canadians in its history to be a member of the conference, and so it was kind of unusual to it was a kind of a weird circumstance, but it was, since I'm a political junkie, I really did enjoy it. And each year that the conference has a mission in Israel, and like a 1-week mission in Israel, where you basically get to meet all the power players in the country. But prior to that, there's an optional add-on, which takes you to some unusual place. So in 2018, which is the only time that I did the add-on, we went to the Emirates, to Abu Dhabi and to Dubai, which was a great experience. But when we were in particular in Abu Dhabi, because most of the key leadership of the country is based in Abu Dhabi, and we met with several of the sheikhs, including the person who basically is the de facto president of the Emirates, and his name is one second. Basically, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. See, they're all the sons of Zayed Al Nahyan. There's 7 of them, and they're all the sheikhs, the leaders of all of the various of the 7 Emirates. The Emirates it's basically a joining together of 7 different groupings that united to form the United Arab Emirates. But there's 7 Emirates. Each one is led by one of the sons of Zayed, who after whom the airport is named, and you see his picture all over the country. So we had meetings with several of his 3 or 4 of his brothers. One of them who's the finance minister, the foreign affairs minister, and and they would all speak to us. They all spoke, they spoke English very well. They're very, very fluent in English, very gracious to us. And to the point where the custom was, when we met the head of the country, they had us all, we were all standing in a circle, and there were 70 of us on this mission. It's a lot of people. We were all standing in a circle, and the head shaykh would come around and pour everybody tea. himself. That would give you a little teacup, and they would pour you tea as a gesture of welcome. And it was it was really kind of interesting. And it took about half an hour because we're a lot of people. And so the head of the country is pouring tea for you, which is kind of cool. And then they took us into a room after where they had this. We weren't supposed to have a meal because there was a kashrut issue, but they seated us at a table and had these where they had these huge vats of food set like you've never seen anything like this. It was like we're in a Persian banquet in the time of Ahasuerus in the story of Esther. We were like transported back into the ancient world. And the problem was we couldn't eat. We didn't know what it was. So someone said, "Well, then one of the head people said to us, 'Don't worry, it's not meat; it's just camel.'" And we learned there are more ways to serve a camel, and they also served us camel milk, which we determined was not kosher. So it was rather awkward. So we would find a vegetable to nibble on to be polite, but it was one of the more comical scenes. But that's irrelevant to what we're talking about. This is the sense we got when dignitaries would speak to us was that when the question was asked, "Are you going to establish relations with Israel?" And they said they said, "We'd love to, but we can't yet. We're waiting for the Saudis. That's their huge neighbor. They weren't going to act until the Saudis. But obviously now the Saudis have lost a lot of prestige in the world because of Khashoggi, the journalist that they murdered. They've lost a lot of prestige, and so they no longer felt they had to wait for the Saudis to be the first to move in the direction of recognizing Israel. But they wanted to, and they would never say anything bad about Israel. We were there for 3-4 days. All these speakers, nobody once ever mentioned the word Palestinian. That was just fascinating. The only person who mentioned it was one of the questioners from our group who was representing, I think, Shalom Achshav, Peace Now, one of the very liberal Jewish organizations in the U.S. That person asked the question about the Palestinians, and the speaker just basically blew it off and didn't really say anything. So that wasn't there. That's not a concern of theirs at all. They never fought in wars with Israel. They never had any antagonism. They don't really care about the Palestinians, which was, for the Palestinians, that's a problem, but it's clearly for Israel, it was not an obstacle. They weren't going to say, we can't do anything until you have a peace treaty with it. They didn't really care. So that's really why a lot of people are happy about this, except the Palestinians. Israelis will be thrilled because Israelis love to travel. And if you ever go to Cyprus, because we did go to Cyprus on one of these missions, and the airport has a larger duty-free area than Pearson. And it's a tiny airport. The airport is the size, it's not much bigger than our Sisterhood Hall if you take away the duty-free shops. But they have like a whole mall. You have the Sisterhood Hall attached to Yorkdale. We have this huge duty-free area. Why? It's all for the Israelis, because they come, they go shopping, they go back home. Now they can go to Dubai, to the big mall where there are 1,250 stores. The only thing, I made one purchase at the Dubai Mall, which was an iced coffee at Tim Hortons. So there is a Tim Hortons in Dubai. I just want you to know that. But it's really kind of a very, very beautiful and attractive country. The Emirates is interesting because 10% of the population, and it's a small population, I think it's about 1 million, 10% of the population are citizens. 90% are not. So basically have no rights. They're not mistreated, they're not abused, but they've come to work from other Arab countries and other parts of the world. But it's a very unusual society where the vast majority of the people are not citizens, and just a very small number are citizens. And my assumption is the citizens all tend to be rather wealthy. We were taking a bus from Abu Dhabi to Dubai, which is about a 90-minute trip. And for 5 minutes outside of Dubai until you get into the city, there was one super luxury car dealership after another. All of the top, if you were driving a Lexus, you're a schlepper. I mean, it was all of these names, I can't think of any right now, but it was, so I mentioned to one of my colleagues on the trip, I said that, that there are more car dealerships here than people, which is, but it's a very, rather incredible, like, where there's this incredible clustering of wealth, et cetera. So that's, the Emirates is rather unusual. So in a sense, somebody asked me, was I surprised by this? I said, I wasn't at all surprised. It was a surprise because of the timing, but the fact that this would happen, I think, was inevitable. And so I must, and clearly, as you will find out as we proceed in this discussion, or in this, and so far it's not a discussion, it's just me talking. But as we go further, I'm going to talk a lot about Donald Trump, and it won't all be complimentary. But in this case, clearly he played, and Kushner played. They played a role that was significant. They were the closers. But these discussions have been going on for more than 10 years. There's been, a lot of dialogue between Israeli ministers and other officials and key people in Dubai. So there's been a lot of discussion, but they needed a closer. The Trump administration came on and they were the closers. Very similar, by the way, to the role that Bill Clinton played during the Oslo Accords, like in 1992, I think it was 1992, where those negotiations were in secret going on in Oslo. That's why they're called the Oslo Accords for a long time. And only at the end did the US come in, when they were informed about this. And then Bill Clinton took over, and the signing was at the White House lawn, which you all remember the images of that. So, so clearly the Trump administration, they were the closers here. Trump was the closer, and Jared Kushner. And so the Rabbinical Assembly issued a statement yesterday. I think it was yesterday, the day before. Oh, no, so this past Friday, August 14th, basically acknowledging the Trump administration for brokering the deal and talking about how good this is for peace and for the Middle East. That made me smile, because I was involved as president of the Rabbinical Assembly with at least two statements that were praising and acknowledging the Trump administration. And the people that were involved in that group were not really big fans of the Trump administration, but yet we felt we had to. One was Jerusalem, and we'll talk a bit about that too as we go further. But because you got to acknowledge good when it happens, and this was very favorable. Now, I think the forward is correct that one of their commentaries on this issue last week suggested that do not feel that this is going to have influence on the American election. It's not going to, a person who is well, clearly the people that are in Trump's circle, his supporters, they're already his supporters. People who are not going to be swung because of this. Maybe a few in the center, maybe a very small number of people. Most Americans don't really, not outside of the Jewish world, let's say, and the evangelical world, most Americans don't really care a lot about this. It means nothing to them. It doesn't affect their lives, whether Israel and the UAE have relations or not. The evangelicals are already in Trump's corner, so there's nothing to change there. They're not going to, they can't, they're already there. And the Jews are, the Jews are basically, largely opposed to Trump, and I think with 71% and maybe 29% in favor. Most of the support is in the Orthodox and Haredi world, with some outside of but a minority of support elsewhere. I remember, a personal memory, again, when I was president of the Rabbinical Assembly, I was in New York for meetings the day of the election in 2018. And so I was there that day, and I remember the next day walking into the Rabbinical Assembly office, and all of the staff, mostly who were like millennials, they're young people in the 40s and under, they were all sitting at their desks sobbing. They were all crying. They were devastated. I mean, there was like this deep sense of mourning. So showing that, then that reflected the bulk of the Jewish world, because they just really were very upset that Trump won and Clinton lost. That just to me was very, very powerful sight to see, and these kids that were just so upset, and there's no, this is what they didn't know how they were going to face the coming 4 or potentially 8 years, and so there were the fact. So very few people who are in that camp are going to decide now they're going to be supporting Trump because of the Emirates relations with this. It's really irrelevant, I think, in terms of the U.S. elections. There'll be maybe a few people who are on the fence. But what I really want to talk to you about, and I will at some point open to questions, what I really want to talk to you about is the larger question, is Donald Trump good for Israel? And my honest answer, I'll give you, I think a lot of you will know my answer from comments that I've made over the years. But my honest answer is I think he's a disaster for Israel. Notwithstanding a couple of things that he's done that have been good, but not necessarily for the reason we think he did them. Just by coincidence, in today's Haaretz, there's an article that where the headline is, Trump says he moved the embassy to Jerusalem for the evangelicals. So just yesterday, Trump gave a speech, and he was talking to an evangelical audience, and he said that he moved the embassy to Jerusalem for the evangelicals because Christians are more excited by that than the Jewish people. He said, we moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. Well, he didn't really move it. The capital was Jerusalem, but that's beside the point. And he goes on, that's for the evangelicals. You know, it's amazing with that. The evangelicals are more excited by that than the Jewish people. It's incredible. The Golan Heights, don't forget, we did the Golan Heights too. And then he talks about the relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It's really great for the evangelicals because they love Israel. Evangelicals love Israel. And then he says he gets more calls from evangelicals than from the Jews for recognizing his support of Israel. So it wasn't necessarily out of his deep devotion to the Jewish community or to his son-in-law and daughter, who's ostensibly is Jewish now, but it was because of the evangelicals that really motivated this activity, because that's his base, and there's nothing he can do to lose them. One of the interesting features about the Jerusalem issue was the dedication of the embassy, which, by the way, normally to these kinds of things, Jewish leadership would be invited. And I, at the time, was president of the Rabbinical Assembly. I would have got an invitation. I was at 2 of Obama's Hanukkah receptions, not invited to Trump's Hanukkah reception because nobody who was not Orthodox was invited. At the Obama receptions, there was everybody from secular to Hasidic, everybody in between. It was really a full gathering of the leadership of the Jewish world. That ended with Trump, where it's only the Orthodox that he will deal with. So one of the headline speakers were the evangelicals at the dedication of the embassy, not the Jews. And one of the speakers was Robert Jeffries, who basically is a documented anti-Semite. He has talked about how Judaism leads people away from God to an eternity of separation from God in hell. And this was the chief spokesman at the dedication of the embassy in Jerusalem. So there are a lot of aspects of Trump that are, that even though the headline is good, we appreciate the fact that he's moved the embassy, because we've all been wanting that. We all want Jerusalem to be recognized as Israel's capital by the world. And it's something that I get sermons about in the past. We all want it. But I have to say personally, not because I didn't get an invitation, I'm not personalizing this, but because it's, to me, there's a taint on it because of the way it was done, in the sense that he's gone out of his way. This is not the only time in this speech yesterday, but the many other times where he is angry at the Jews for not supporting him, not thanking him, and the evangelicals thank him. And so they're the ones really who are the true lovers of Zion, of Israel, not the Jews. Which, to say I find offensive is somewhat of an understatement. So another incident that I just want to recall that took place in in 2017. The fall of in the summer of 2017, so 3 years ago, when you remember, of course, you remember Charlottesville. That was the third anniversary, which just was observed a few days ago. And after that, right after that time, the movements, the rabbinic movements in the Jewish world in the U.S. were conferring as to whether or not we wanted what was traditional in Obama's time, the annual phone call with the president, where we would have, and I did it, a few times I was on the call with Obama, and not with 1,000 rabbis, so it wasn't like it's a personal chat, but he would speak for about half an hour to us, and there would be people who could ask questions. There'd be, a symbolic number of people who could ask questions, but it was powerful. You're on the phone with the president of the United States. So the decision of most of the movements was to decline the call that year, because it was right after Charlottesville, and we were angry. So we joined that boycott. And eventually the call that took place was just with the Orthodox, and it was like a 5-minute call. He didn't take questions, but we boycotted it. And I have to tell you, I took a lot of arrows for that. A lot of people were angry because it was disrespectful to the president. So our answer was, well, he disrespects the office. But that was one of the times I had to take arrows, because people felt you have to honor the president no matter what he does. But we felt after Charlottesville, him equating Nazis with those protesting hatred, he's very fine people on both sides, that we didn't want to be talking to him at that point. I want to read to you something that was written by, was actually spoken by Charles Krauthammer. Charles Krauthammer, I was a big fan of his. I still am, even though he's gone. Not only because he was a former Montrealer, but and he was a Republican his whole life, a moderately right-wing conservative. Probably not even that moderate. He was clearly a right-wing conservative. Never agreed with Obama on anything. But he was somebody who he hated Trump. And he said that one of his comments was in the summer of 2016, just before Trump was elected. He said, "I used to think Trump was an 11-year-old and an undeveloped schoolyard bully. I was off by about 10 years. His needs are more primitive, an infantile hunger for approval and praise, a craving that can never be satisfied. Nothing in the world outside of himself has value, only insofar as it sustains and inflates him. He's dangerously out of the mainstream and temperamentally unfit to command the nation." Again, from a Syria conservative Republican commentator. And I remember watching him after Charlottesville. I used to be a big fan of Fox News before Trump. I now never watch it, but I did occasionally watch it when Krauthammer was on. So the day after Charlottesville, he was on a panel, and the others on the panel were defending Trump. Oh, he didn't really mean it. He wasn't really saying that the Nazis were good people. They were trying. And then the Krauthammer basically said, "No, what we witnessed yesterday was a moral disgrace." He said, "What is shocking is that the president of the United States did not have the instinctive, reflexive, automatic response you would expect of any American leader in what we saw across the spectrum in American leadership and among the populace, in being utterly revolted by these right-wing, white supremacist, neo-Nazi groups. But the president did not do what was absolutely natural. That's what makes this a story. It seems to me you start by denouncing what is obvious. The fact that the president did not is simply stunning." And another commentator who, thank God, is still very vibrant and active now with the New York Times is Brent Stevens. And again, I'm going back to all my former Machadim days when I was president of the RA, and I had an APAC conference when we had our RA meeting, our Rabbinical Assembly meeting. We would have each of the denominations would have an opportunity to have a separate meeting. So we had 300 rabbis in a room, and we would have a guest speaker. So the guest speaker that one year was Brent Stevens, and I was interviewing him. That was the program. And he was also, again, a conservative Republican who quit the Republican Party after Trump was elected, and is someone who despises Trump, but again, is somebody coming from the right, coming not a liberal, but somebody who's coming from conservatism, and feels that a president has to command moral authority. So I'm going to conclude in a moment by just suggesting why I personally, and Brent Stevens wrote a piece in the Times in the end of 2018, December 2018, and the heading of the article was "Donald Trump is bad for Israel." So about a month ago, I received a very anxious email from one of our members who I adore, and who basically was very upset that Biden was going to win the election because it had to be Trump, because Biden would be a disaster for Israel. So I wrote her back, and it kind of, and I said that, look, I can tell you that I really think that's not true. I think more that Biden would be better in many respects for Israel, even though Trump has done a couple of good things. You have to give him credit for the good things that have happened, whatever the motivation, and it wasn't really for the Jewish vote, it was for the evangelical vote. But whatever, he did some good things. We recognize, we're happy the American embassy is in Jerusalem, even though it's not really an embassy, it's the consulate where they put up a plaque that calls it the embassy now. It's not, the embassy still functions in Tel Aviv, don't tell anybody. But basically, but the fact recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital was a good thing. This stuff, hasn't changed anything on the ground. The recognizing Israel's authority in the Golan, it was it was already done de facto. Now it's de jure. Now it's, before the fact, it's recognized. It's good. We're not complaining. It's a good thing. We're happy. But the real danger are these young people in the office that I saw sobbing the day after he was elected, and that represents an entire generation of our people, our young people, and many of our not so young people, who risk becoming distanced from Israel when Israel is seen as being identified as very close to Trump. And so that's where the being bad for Israel part comes in, because he's not in, when you have almost 80% of the Jewish world who despise Trump, to put it mildly, and then Israel wants to name a village after him in the Golan Heights, even though it's a Potemkin village, it doesn't really exist, and it won't. But nonetheless, when he's being honored there and exalted as the greatest president for Israel's history, it turns off a lot of people, and that's scary. It threatens the bipartisan support that Israel has. Israel has strong support in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. You have extremes in both parties that are not supportive, that are much less supportive. We know that, and that's a concern. But there is a lot of bipartisan support for Israel, and very strong. You go to APAC and you see people like Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, Pelosi, and others who speak with tears in their eyes about their connection to Israel. So so that the danger becomes, if you identify support of Israel with a person who really, I hate to say it, is an awful human being, who is trying to eradicate democracy, who is trying to prevent people from voting, especially the people who he's preventing from voting would largely not be supporting him, gunning at the post office, taking mailboxes off the street. It's mind-boggling what's going on, and that's just one small piece of it. A person who uses language and vilifies people and uses racist expressions in referring to his opponents. That if that's the person that is exemplifying the Israel-U.S. relationship, it puts Israel in a very bad light. That's why a lot of us think that he's not good for Israel. So let's look for a moment at Biden, and then I will open up to your comments and questions. Um, so uh, when I think the only vice president in the history of the United States who had a sukkah at his residence was Joe Biden. He either had a sukkah put up by Chabad at the Naval Observatory where the vice president lives, or he would have a pre-Rosh Hashanah reception for Jewish leadership. So I happened to swing an invitation to the pre-Rosh Hashanah reception in it would have been in 2017, and it was good. I never had more fun in my life. If you like meeting senators and congressmen and White House staff or White House members of the cabinet, I mean, it was really kind of cool. I said, I can't believe, this is really weird who I just had a conversation with. I was talking to Obama's chief of staff for 10 minutes because he's one of 11 siblings. 9 of his brothers are priests, and he wanted to know what a rabbi does. And this is the guy that was Dennis O'Donoghue, who was Obama's chief of staff. It was, I do enjoy talking to, I love shul, talking to the people I normally talk to, the Minyan guys and everyone else. And, it's not often that you get to, this kid from Montreal is talking to the chief of staff of the president of the United States. So it was a very nice reception. Washington has really good kosher catering, by the way. I just thought I would point that out. So, so at this reception, you get at these receptions, you get a photo op with the vice president and the wife. So with Joe and Jill. So I have my picture with them, and you have 1 minute, like a 1 minute conversation. So I think what I said at the time was, you have to think of what to say. Some people are saying my congressman or my senator so-and-so sends his regards. At the time, I think it was Monty Quinter. I was going to say Monty Quinter sends his regards. I don't think that would have resonated. So I said, we love you in Canada. Oh, we love Canada. Jill and I love Canada. That was my influence in terms of the Canada-Biden relationship. But what I really want to report is not that, because that's not important. But what I want to report is I overheard when I was in the line to get the photo op, him saying to somebody, this was 3 months after his son had died of cancer. And he was saying to one of the people who he knew, one of the more connected American Jewish leaders, he said, the first phone call that I received when Bo died was from Bibi Netanyahu. And I'll never forget that. It was very, that was really very touching to hear. It was, and when, when you hear him speak, he tells the same stories all the time about him being with Golda Meir when he was a senator. But there's a lot of very strong, deep affection that he has for Israel. So I certainly would not fear that you're going to be turning to a potentially to a new administration that's going to be hostile to Israel. There's a lot of warmth here, and there's nothing really to fear. I think in a way it will help repair the break that is now taking place between the younger generations of American Jews who are feeling, who feel very far away from the evangelical community and Israel. So I think that will be rectified. So I think in a way it'll be an improvement in the relationship. And he's not planning to undo any of the steps that Trump is. He's not putting the embassy back in Tel Aviv. He's not making a change in terms of the status of the Golan, and he's certainly not going to do anything about the relationship with the Emirates, which he supports. And you all know as well that Kamala Harris, who I also feel close to because she spent 5 years in my hometown of Montreal, the same years that I was in New York at JTS, she was at Westmount High School in Montreal. But if you've read anything about, she has a Jewish husband, Jewish stepchildren. They call her Mamula. And also, by the way, her track record on Israel is perfect. She's been extremely supportive. The only person who was a contender to be the vice presidential candidate who said nothing critical about Israel, refused to criticize Israel at all. So it was the best choice in terms of Israel. By the way, my friends in Israel tell me that Israelis are delighted by that choice. They feel very relieved that that was a very indicative of a strong continuing relationship with Israel. So I did advise our congregant that not to fear not to fear a Biden administration. There will be no degrading of the relationship. If anything, in certain respects, it would improve, because it's no longer a relationship that's based on the evangelicals, who are very supportive of Israel, but not always our best friends. Finally, before I open up, and the one last thing I want to mention is something that really fascinated me. And this goes back a couple of weeks it has happened in July, that a Haredi rabbi, Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky, who's the head of the Talmudic Yeshiva of Philadelphia, was interviewed in Mishpacha magazine. I'm sure you all subscribe. And he's a member of the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah, the Council of Sages, an ultra-Orthodox, excuse me, a Haredi rabbinic body. And he told people they have to vote for Trump because he's done a good job, and you have to show gratitude. You have to show Hakara Satov, it's called. You have to show gratitude for the good things he's done. So he said, yeah, okay, we understand that he often says things that he shouldn't say, and he doesn't always behave the way he should, but he's been a mensch in terms of the Jews, and you have to support him. So the reaction to that was really interesting. And this to me was, because my assumption has always been that that community is rock solid, lockstep in support of Trump. And what happened to break that image was a letter that was written by 5 leading Haredi rabbis, ultra-Orthodox rabbis, led by Avi Shafran, who is the spokesperson for Agudat Yisrael, the Haredi rabbinic organization. And they wrote a letter basically attacking Kamenetsky and saying the following. Just read a brief quote: shameless dissembling and personal indecency acted out in public before the entire country are in the end no less morally corrosive than the embrace of abortion on demand or the normalization of same-gender relationships. And basically saying it was repugnant for Jewish rabbinic leadership to tell people they should be supporting Trump. Didn't mention Trump's name, but it was obviously who they're talking about. And what's interesting, what he says, basically, the ultra-Orthodox are opposed to abortion, they're opposed to egalitarianism, then they're not giving women aliyot next Shabbos, you know what you're dealing with. We know that. But that's what they're saying, that's what they're opposed to. And Shafran and his group were saying, how can you not oppose a person who is vile in his human behavior and make him the savior of the Jewish people? That was astounding, that you had this voice of 5 critically prominent rabbis in the Haredi world who were opposing this deification of Trump that you see in the right wing of our communities. So to me, that really resonated, because it's no news for conservative rabbis or reform rabbis or modern Orthodox rabbis not to like Trump. That's not a chiddush. There's no news there. But when you see people in the other world saying, guys, listen, you don't see this in the evangelical world. There's no evangelical leader that's come forward and said, morality means something. I mean, if we're telling people they have to behave in a certain way, how do we honor a man who totally doesn't do that, who's foul in every aspect of life, but he's going to give us right-wing judges? So we're going to say, fine, he's kosher because he gives us the judges we want, and he's making it harder. He's going to make it harder for women to secure abortions, etc. So for that reason, you make a guy who's a vile person, he becomes your role model in life. How do you do that? And but you don't see that in the evangelical world. But the fact that it came out in the Jewish world, to me, was very interesting. So I don't think what happened last week, even though we like it and we say Yesher Koach, Donald, Yesher Koach, Jared, you did a good job here, but we're still not happy. We still think that a leader of the free world has to be a mensch. And I will tell you, I've met him twice, and I've had no great influence on his life. But what I've seen in any personal contact or in places where he's spoken, Biden is a mensch. There's no case a mensch. He will lose himself in his answers to long questions, and his eyes don't know what he's talking about. in terms of he gets a little bit lost in speech, and he makes a few gaffes, but he's a good guy. I don't think we can say that about Trump, and that's why he doesn't have my vote, even though I don't have a vote in the election. Okay, I've talked enough, and I'm going to open up and let's see how many people I angered and who are now incensed with what I said. Let me unmute. Wave a hand if you want to say something. Tell me that I'm totally crazy, which I know, but we have a few Americans here, so you may want to comment. A few people actually have a vote in this election, which I don't. So anybody, if you wave a hand, and I will unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. I think you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Anybody want to ask any comment or question? I mean, I must have made somebody upset. No? No. Oh, Cheryl, I think you're waving. Okay, so Cheryl, unmute yourself. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Rabbi, and everybody. Hi, hello, how are you? My question is this. I kind of think that the UAE is so immoral, and they are such a sexist, racist, horrible, murderous regime. It's like they're like the Nazis. And I'm wondering how it's good for the Jews.
Where do you get that from? I mean, I'm not aware of that. And where's that coming? I know the Saudis are, but I don't know about the UAE being like that.
They're terrible to their women. They're terrible to their women. They're very sexist and very chauvinistic, and they kill people. I mean, it's a dictatorship. So anybody that's not in favor of them and doesn't stroke them, they're like Trump. And so I don't know how doing a deal with them is a good idea. Like, it's like doing a deal with the Nazis. And how can you ever trust them?
No, I'm not sure that. I mean, I think you're being. I mean, I'm not saying that they're great tzaddikim, but I'm not sure that they may be being overstated. I've never really, and I've been quite acquainted with, in our prep for going there for a few days, and I've never heard that kind of. I mean, yeah, they're going to be, they'll be male. It's a male-dominated society, but that's the Arab world. I mean, that's what you're talking about. Looking, you look. Watch some of the films on, Schnitzel, or the one, I just come blanking on the title, but the woman who goes to Berlin, it was on Netflix. Those are not women-friendly communities either, but it doesn't mean they're like the Nazis. I mean, I think I'm not sure that, and part of it, you want to. What's important for Israel is having a relationship with. Expanding, because that's going to lead to all other Gulf countries who basically are sympathetic with Israel. The more you break the boycott that used to exist, it basically, it strengthens Israel's position in that part of the world. And part of what keeps them, unites them, is they all this tremendous hatred of Iran, and they figure that Israel is going to protect them. So, and they feel much so that no one's saying they're a perfect society. I didn't get the sense, and I'll look more into this, but I didn't get the sense that it was I think the Saudis is a more, a much more repressive society. You can get the sense that it was I mean, the interesting thing here again is 90% of the people who live there are not citizens, which is it's like a crazy circumstance. The whole country is very unusual, but I'm not sure.
I agree with you that the youth are so disenfranchised, both in the States and in Israel, and I don't see making deals with any immoral, sexist regime going to help that at all.
Okay, I don't know, but there hasn't been any. There's been no protest anywhere in the Jewish world, North America, or in Israel.
I know
the Democrats are supporting this. I mean, there's been nobody saying this is a bad deal. So I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure everyone's hearing the same thing. But look, it's a valid opinion. Let me see if anyone else wants to comment, or any of our Americans want to say something. Oh, I see. American, yay, the Shimmers. Okay, you have to unmute yourself, Bernie. You have to unmute yourself. Oh, you did.
Yeah, go ahead. So, just a couple of things. The first is that when this agreement with the Emirates was announced, it was also inferred there would be at least one other country that would be joining in. Do you have any idea who that other?
I think Oman today. There was a statement in the media today that they're saying they're looking forward to very quickly establishing relationships with Israel. I think Bahrain is in the lineup. My brother did a lot of work. He was the lawyer for the Emir of Bahrain for many years. He used to travel there like twice a month. And he also said there were very warm relationships. There's a small Jewish community there. In Bahrain, in the UAE, there is a very small Jewish community, maybe about 1,000 people. It's grown since I was there. When we were there, we met with the leader, a young guy originally from New York, who was leading the Jewish community, a modern Orthodox guy, in Dubai. And they have a couple of shuls in Dubai because you have to have a shul not to go to. They have two Orthodox minyanim, a liberal Orthodox minyanim, and there's evidently an egalitarian minyan that began, which is very, very, very recently. There are, I think we'll see a lot of the Gulf countries lining up to, because they all want it. Not that the door has been opened, because it's good for them. They want to be able to, they're interested in potentially getting weapons. They want Israel to protect them from the Iranians, because they all trust Israel as being their wall against Iran, whom they all fear and hate. And they just want the tourism, and they'll get tremendous tourism. It'd be very hard to get a flight from. We had to travel, by the way. We had to go from the Emirates to Israel. We had to go via Jordan, and we had to take we flew to Jordan, and then we had a meeting with the king, which wasn't nishlecht. It wasn't a bad thing. We went to the palace in Amman, and then we took a bus to Jerusalem. And one of the ironies was that when every time I go to Israel now, the Emirates does not stamp your passport. Neither does Israel, by the way, but Jordan does. So I have a Jordan stamp in my passport, which I'll have for it's a 10-year passport, so I have it for a while. Every time I'm leaving Israel, I'm flagged, because when they do the security, they say, well, what were you doing in Jordan? So I explained I was in a conference of presidents of Jewish organizations. So who did you meet? I said, the king. So I love it. It's great. So they call over, this one calls over like Rip Super. And they say, wow. So I kind of sort of very funny, but every time they flag that, like, what were you doing in Jordan? I was in Jordan. I said in Jordan for 2.5 hours. But so it's kind of, I don't get that opportunity often to say, what were you doing? Like, I was meeting the queen.
So can I ask one more thing?
Yeah.
And that is, do these new alignments with Israel provide sufficient pressure on the Palestinians to think about their position?
It should, the problem with the Palestinians, a lot of problems with the Palestinians. Look, they're suffering, and I think we all believe, but most of us believe that at some point there should be a resolution that gives them some semblance of a state. I think, even the Trump administration is advocating that. They may not be as generous as they need to be, and they need to involve them in negotiation. But the problem with the Palestinians, ask Clinton, ask Dennis Ross, people that were, that tried very hard to negotiate, they will never seal on a deal. They've been offered, we know the story, they've been offered 97% of the territory they're claiming, even plus land swaps. So they'd end up with 100% of the land quality. And they'll never say yes. They just don't know how to say yes. And if you read Dennis Ross's book, you read Clinton's autobiography, and they all lament the fact that they don't know how to say yes. Even when you're giving them whatever they want, they're still going to walk away from it. And was Arafat, he started an intifada when they were being offered everything at Oslo, and then they had the Y Accord meeting, that a little bit later, and they just won't say yes. So at some point, people just forget it already. We're giving up. We're just going to do everything else around. They're very upset, the Palestinians, because they're being forgotten, and they are being forgotten. But it's deserved. It's deserved. The fact is, they at some point needed to say yes, or to be serious. And they're always, they refuse to negotiate. Whenever something makes them unhappy, they're not going to negotiate. They're going to walk away from the table. They won't meet. And then they should have met with Trump, with Kushner, even though I'm not a fan of his, but they should have, to refuse to talk to the people because you don't like things they've done. It precludes the possibility of there being any agreement. So Israel's not going to, the world's not going to be patient. The world is largely, reaching a point, will reach a point where they're going to be forgotten, except Iran won't forget them, Turkey won't forget them. But if you have 10 Arab countries that are going to make relationships with Israel and not going to wait for the Palestinians, because they realize that's never going to happen. unless there's a real change in leadership and they decide to get serious and get, a functional state, and they'll get that at some point, but the best example, I mean, where they sabotage every opportunity for there to be a relationship, when Israel, Arik Sharon, right-wing prime minister, unilaterally withdraws from Gaza at a great price. I mean, it tore up Israeli society. People were really upset, but I think it was a very courageous decision. They said, okay, you're not going to negotiate with us, but we're just leaving. It's not original Jewish territory. It was Philistine territory. It wasn't Jewish territory. We don't have an ancestral connection to Gaza. Yeah, people have lovely swimming pools and beautiful homes, but that's not a reason to stay in an area where we really don't belong ultimately. And we just left. So they had the opportunity, and we all know this. They could have used that opportunity to build a society in Gaza, build hospitals, build schools. They built tunnels to invade Israel. And they wouldn't, and they tore down whatever Israel left. Israel didn't destroy their properties. They had greenhouses because there was great agriculture. They destroyed all the greenhouses. They destroyed all of the opportunities they had to build a functioning society. And at some point, people are going to say, people like the Emiratis, other people are going to say too, look, we don't care anymore. We're just tired of it. And they realize that, and they're very frustrated. They're yelling and screaming, and no one really cares, except the few countries that are going to back them because of their hatred for Israel, like Iran and Turkey and one or two others. But basically, you're not hearing a lot of dissent. And I imagine as well, and there were in some of the articles posted today, their inclinations of within the Palestinian world, there's a lot of dissent as well. Just like in Lebanon, there are a lot of people that are really, obviously very angry with the tragic bombing there and what happened. There are a lot of people that are really upset, but they're not, and these are people that would be, okay with a relationship with Israel. They don't want, the society to be continuing this hatred that takes you nowhere and that serves no purpose. It just perpetuates an unfortunate situation. And, and at some point there'll be a Lebanese revolt against Hezbollah, which is of course Iran, that, they're trying to confront Israel out of Lebanon. But the Lebanese don't want that. I mean, they want to be able to live. I mean, because Lebanon was a beautiful country. So, and then they could not return to being a beautiful country as long as you still have those, people and those terrorist groups that are allowed to function freely. That's not where the people are at some point. So there might be internal rebellions that will take place, but Israel, rightfully, at some point, is just going to continue moving on without waiting for the Palestinians to decide they want to make peace. Because I think none of us will outlive that happening. I hate to say it, but I don't think there's anything in the short term that's going to make that possible. In other words, because the Palestinians, as Clinton said, are just not able to say yes. And Dennis Ross, and these are people that were, they're not from the Trump administration. So they're not going to wait for that to happen. And that's why, by the way, basically there's bipartisan support for President Trump's action in terms of the UAE, opening the door for other countries in the Arab world to feel they have the hechsher to establish relationships with Israel, and that's a good thing. And again, obviously I've made very clear that I'm not a fan of Trump, but we have to give credit where credit is due, and there are some good things that have happened. David Friedman, who's the ambassador, also not a huge fan of his, but as a real estate lawyer, I'm not sure that necessarily would qualify him to, or no, he was a banker. I think he was one of Trump's bankruptcy lawyers. He needed a few of those, but but I have sympathy for him because his father was a conservative rabbi.
So the only other thing I would say is that I'm severely disappointed in the moral bankruptcy of the Republican Party and the elected officials, members of Congress. Just unbelievable.
Well, they'll carry that shame for a long time. You know what? Had I had a vote if I had been an American, I would have probably at least once would have voted for George W. Bush. And I would have, to go back to, a Romney or a Bush or, a Lava Shalom, I'm really losing it. The senator who passed away, from Arizona. Oh, McCain, John McCain. Um, I would have, I would have been honored to vote for one of them. For McCain for sure. If I don't know who, if it was Obama and McCain, I'm not sure who I would have voted for, but I would tend to be center. I consider myself a centrist, maybe sometimes slightly leaning to the right. I'm socially liberal, but in terms of foreign policy and stuff, more on the conservative side. So I'd kind of be in the middle, I guess. But I could see it. But I think that the Americans are really suffering because of the lack of a credible, a sane center-right party. This person now, I mean, again, I don't believe in focusing on the extremes. I don't think you take the quartet and there's only 3 of them that are anti-Israel. Not for one of them is not in that group, but to focus on them. And the Democrats started to focus on this crazy person who's QAnon, who's now going to be a congresswoman in the next election, because she won the primary in an area that is like totally 100% Republican. So there's no question about it. A person that is anti-Semitic and it's just completely guns mishiga on the far right. I don't focus on them, but if you look at where the center of the party is, the mainstream of a party, and the Republicans really have a lot to answer for, and it will take. That's why you have people like Brent Stevens, who was a Republican, and others, and people that are in this the Lincoln Project. You ever watch the videos of the Lincoln Project? You should Google it and watch their videos. This group of Republicans, very active Republicans who hate Trump, and have made these video commercials that are really very well done. But these are people, they want to go back to a sane. You need a sane conservative party, and that they've allowed Trump to, and it's really it's causing them a huge. It may take them 2 or 3 election cycles to overcome. I mean, they still could win this election. And this is not a foregone conclusion. It's not clear who's going to win, who's not going to. But you have you need to go back to a sane right of center party, and that's. See, let me make one other comment. I think that one of the, it's in the people, like say in our community and the evangelicals, for example, that are Trump supporters. You're talking about people largely with one issue agendas. In other words, they're one issue voters, whether it's Israel, and with the evangelicals, it's also abortion and judges, but with Jews, it's primarily Israel. I have to be honest and say there was a time I used to be a liberal all my life until Stephen Harper came around, and then I voted conservative. In that sense, I was being a one issue voter, but I felt they're protected because you're dealing with a guy that was still sane, that was a normal human being, was a decent human being, a family man, not a bad person. Probably socially, I would have been more identified with the liberals than with the conservatives on social issues, but they were pretty centrist. I mean, basically, most Democrats would be conservative. The Conservative Party would be more aligned with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. It's not that right wing by and large, with some exceptions. But it wasn't like, it didn't. There wasn't this. You didn't have a leader who basically was so objectionable in terms of the way he would speak, the way he would behave in public, the things he would say, his acts, his attitude towards women, towards minorities. That didn't exist here. I mean, so it was easier to be a one issue voter then, because the other issues weren't that. There wasn't such a big difference. Nobody on either side was going to take away Medicare, take away socialized medicine in Canada. No one was going to, OHIP was going to remain. No one was advocating against, what the Americans would call socialized medicine. Nobody wants that to change. That was nobody really seriously, except on the far right, was advocating changing abortion laws. That's not an issue. That's a resolved issue in Canada. So basically, it's easier to be a one issue voter here because you're not dealing with extremists in the main parties. I'm not going to talk about the NDP. That's another story. But in terms of the main parties that are going to win a federal election, you don't have that issue. But now the Republicans have a lot to answer for. And the McConnells and others who have been, who've refused to stand up to something which they personally hate, and it. And there are times where they will oppose and they will say things, but they're so intimidated by Trump because he's achieved such power that it's really, I'd be very scared as an American in terms of the assault on their democracy. This election thing is horrible. I don't care what side you're on. I don't know how you can advocate closing down removing sorting machines, taking mailboxes off the street. God forbid people should vote by mail. Better they should, die of COVID, which of course is going to vanish like miraculously very quickly, and it's not really affecting anyone, and everyone's fine and healthy. It's really scary, and that's why I really worry if Israel would become too aligned with one party. That's not a party that's representing itself well in the world. It doesn't do well for Israel's image, and I think that's where Brent Stevens will say it's bad for the Jews, bad for Israel. But I would welcome the day, as Bernie suggested, when you would have a credible. You need the U.S. needs a strong, legitimate, sensible, intelligent option, right of center. You need that balance. You need to have somebody who is credible. You need to have a leader that you can be proud of, even if you don't agree with them. Brent Stevens, when I was doing the panel with Brent Stevens, he said that, and he said, I almost never agreed with Barack Obama. I disagreed with him in almost every issue. But when he would speak at a memorial or something, I felt he was my president and I could be proud of him. And I can't feel that way anymore. And this was a lifelong Republican who said that there was something, you could disagree on political ground. You could have strong disagreements on all kinds of issues, economic issues, social issues, etc. That's legitimate. That's part of the game. But you have to be a match. You have to be decent. I mean, and that's why I was so impressed by Avi Shafran and these other ultra-Orthodox rabbis who banded together to say, don't tell us we have to be voting for Trump, because there are other issues involved, primarily morality, the fundamentals of Judaism, how we treat human beings, how we talk about human beings, how we treat women, that has to mean something. And it's not just, you can't judge on Israel alone, especially when the other side is not anti-Israel. They really are not. And then that has to be emphasized. They're not. And I don't think there'll be a huge change. It's just the tone will change, but you're not going to, there's no substantive issue that's going to change from this administration to the next. We'll arrive a little bit over time, but if there's one further question, I will take it, and then I'm going to say goodbye to you. I hope okay, I think we saw you. I'm not going to be as political next time. I'm actually going to look at, Noreen, is that you?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for showing both sides and being balanced. And I want to assure you that my American daughter will not vote for Trump. And
I'm shocked.
She's been very, very unhappy about the situation there. And she lives with it. So,
well, I'm very, as I've given all these examples, I feel very attached in many respects to the U.S. My father, Alav Shalom, fought in the U.S. Army. Although he was in a typing pool, he never saw a battlefield. But but nonetheless, he was in World War II. He was overseas with the American Army, and I feel a lot of connection, and and I spent a lot of time in this. Not now, but I've been over the years spending a lot of time in the States. I have a lot of very close American friends that through my rabbinic activities. And I'm really hurt. I'm scared for the country. I mean, I think that it's a very dangerous time, and where support of Israel can't be the issue where you make that choice, because it's really, you're going to get it on either side. You really got to, they have a big cleanup that has to be done. And I hope they'll do it. And if not, I just fear for what will be. And by extension, it's not just Israel. It's not just the U.S. It's, other countries will suffer for it too. If this continues, it's just bad. It's bad for the world, actually. And if it's bad for the world, see, Israel, like every other country, needs a competent American administration that should be leading the way in the fight against the pandemic, not in one of the worst situations in the world, leading the way for peace, leading the way for elevating human decency in the world. Not happening, and that's really scary. And I fear for them, and I just hope that things work out. The polls seem to be good, but it's tightening as it is to be expected as it gets closer to the election. We'll see what happens. So thank you for your patience. And we're actually I will try to look at some sources next week to make this a bit more traditional in terms of learning. But this is having to get off my chest what I won't say on the pulpit, because I don't want to go into politics. But I figured I could do it in an intimate group of, how many are we? We are 30, a good even number. So thank you all. and stay safe and have a good rest of the week. And maybe we'll see some of you in Minyanim during the week, and we'll see some of you on Shabbat. Thank you.
Welcome back, Rabbi, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
You can stay in
Right.
Thank
politics.
you so much. You're awesome.
And no anger.
It was really good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it was.
Oh, you're the best. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care and stay well, everybody.
Bye.
Vladimir,
Bye,
too
you
much.
too. Be well, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.